Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Helena, it's been a little while. How are you?
It has been quite a while since we've shared the stage together. I'm not doing too bad. Just had some lovely jam donuts and I'm looking forward to the show tonight.
My favourite, actually. Coming up tonight, Labour have chosen to fund warfare over welfare, and Reform UK are in the middle of their own civil war. Israel has cut off electricity to Gaza. We don't yet know the full extent of the impact of Israel's decision to deprive Palestinians of electricity, but we do know that the last facility in Gaza still receiving power from the Israel Electric Corporation, Deir al-Balah desalination plant, has been cut off. For now, it's running on solar panels and generators and can only produce around 1/7 as much clean water as it could with mains electricity. The facility has some fuel stored, but when that runs out, it will be entirely reliant on solar power. Around 500,000 Palestinians in Gaza are completely reliant on the plant for clean drinking water. UN Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Palestinian Territory, Francesca Albanese, said this: "Genocide alert. Israel cutting off electricity supplies to Gaza means, among others, no functioning desalination stations, ergo, no clean water. Still no sanctions, no arms embargo against Israel means, amongst others, aiding and assisting Israel in the commission of one of the most preventable genocides of our history." Now, Human Rights Watch previously accused Israel of committing acts of genocide by deliberately blocking access to clean water in Gaza. Acting Israel and Palestine director Bill van Esveld told Al Jazeera the following: "We found 4 key things that Israel has done to deliberately block access to water in Gaza. First, pipelines bringing drinking water from Israel to Gaza were blocked. Israel then cut off the electricity supply needed to activate water pumps for reserves inside Gaza, so desalination plants, water wells, and waste management plants stopped working. Some of those facilities had solar panels to power them in case the electricity was cut off. The Israeli military then went in and bulldozed every single one of them in 4 of Gaza's 6 wastewater treatment facilities, leaving nothing to chance. Finally, they prevented any attempts at repair from happening by killing technical staff and preventing humanitarian aid agencies from bringing in water-related supplies. This is a comprehensive policy preventing people from getting any water." The move to cut power to Gaza has even been condemned by Israel's allies. A spokesman for Germany's foreign ministry, you heard that, Germany's foreign ministry, said it is, quote, "unacceptable and not compatible with Israel's obligations under international law." And here in the UK, Starmer's official spokesperson told reporters, quote, "We're clear that a halt on goods and supplies entering Gaza, including basic needs such as electricity, risks breaching Israel's obligations under international humanitarian law." Even Piers Morgan was shocked and tweeted the following: "This is wrong, and it's wrong that Israel even retains the power over Gaza to do this." Now, as well as cutting off electricity, Israel has also been holding Gaza under total siege for the last 8 days. That means no food, fuel, or medical supplies have been allowed to enter. The head of the Gaza Bakers Union, Nasser al-Ajrami, told Reuters that 6 of the territory's 22 remaining bakeries have already shut, as they've run out of cooking gas. He added that unless the siege is lifted, the rest will run out of fuel and flour within a week or so. Israeli public radio reports that cutting aid and electricity is part of a, quote, hell plan drawn up by Israel to pressure Hamas to release the remaining hostages without the previously agreed withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. The plan also includes displacing Palestinians who've returned to the north of the Gaza Strip to the south, and a return to heavy bombing as the final resort. Now, Hamas condemned the move to cut electricity as, quote, "a desperate attempt to pressure our people and their resistance through cheap and unacceptable blackmail tactics. The population of Gaza has already suffered what NGOs describe as an unprecedented man-made humanitarian crisis. For many, this further escalation is hard to endure." A displaced Palestinian woman told Reuters this: "What kind of life are we living? No electricity, no water, no life. We don't even live a proper life. What else is left there in life? May God take us and give us rest. What is there in life anymore that is beautiful? Our children are gone, our youth are gone, our sisters are gone, and my brother is gone, and our situation is bad. Here is no life. What is there? There are no bathrooms, no proper food, and no proper water." Unsurprisingly, Israel's move to deliberately intensify the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza has been met with a flurry of activism in allied Western countries. On Friday night, Trump's Turnberry golf course in Scotland was targeted by Palestine Action. A building was daubed with red paint, pro-Palestine slogans were painted around the course, and parts of the green were dug up. A drone with a Palestinian flag attached was also flown over the Allianz Stadium. You might know that as Twickenham, during the England versus Italy rugby match on Sunday. One London office of Germany insurance company Allianz, which purchased the naming rights for the stadium last September, was also targeted by activists today. As you saw there, activists sprayed the building with red paint and hung a banner reading "Drop Elbit." Elbit Systems is, of course, an Israeli weapons manufacturer that has been targeted extensively by Palestine Action and other activists. A group called Boycott Bloody Insurance has released a report exposing how major global insurers enable Israel's ongoing assault on Palestine. It reveals that insurers, including Allianz, Aviva, AXA, Zurich, and RSA, collectively invested over $1.7 billion in companies supplying military equipment used by Israel since the 7th of October 2023. In the US, the Trump administration is also clamping down on speech and following through on threats to use deportation as a weapon against pro-Palestinian activists. Last week, Axios reported that US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is launching an AI-assisted effort to cancel the visas of foreign nationals who appear to sympathize with Hamas. AI will be used to comb through visa holders' social media profiles, and they'll also check news reports and Jewish students' lawsuits to identify foreign nationals engaged in allegedly anti-Semitic activism. On Saturday night, Mahmoud Khalil, a prominent Palestinian activist who helped lead Colombia's student encampments, was arrested by federal immigration authorities. They claimed they were acting on a State Department order to revoke his green card, which grants him permanent residence in the US. On Saturday night, Mahmoud Khalil, a prominent Palestinian activist who helped lead Colombia's student encampments, was arrested by federal immigration authorities. They claimed they were acting on a State Department order to revoke his green card, which grants him permanent residence in the US. Under existing laws, government departments do not have the power to revoke green cards. President of New York Immigration Coalition, Murad Awade, said, quote, "A green card can only be revoked by an immigration judge," showing once again that the Trump administration is willing to ignore the law in order to instill fear and further its agenda. In response to report of Khalil's arrest, Rubio tweeted the following: "We will be revoking the visas and or green cards of Hamas supporters in America so they can be deported." Earlier today, I was joined by Max Geller of Palestine Action. I began by asking him to explain the group's rationale behind targeting Donald Trump's golf course and Allianz insurers.
Donald Trump has made very clear his intentions on Gaza, and we want to make very clear to Donald Trump and everyone else that Palestine Action will not be taking this lying down. I think what's really important to understand about both these actions is they don't involve moral appeals. We are not appealing to Donald Trump's moral consciousness. Donald Trump doesn't have a moral consciousness. We are trying to affect his bottom line. We were able to shut down his golf course for an entire day. They have lost all of Sunday's profits because they were unable to open. And they have to hire more security. These are the types of things Donald Trump actually cares about. All he cares about is money and his bottom line. And Palestine Action hit that on Sunday. And the same thing for Allianz. We are not trying to make a moral argument to Allianz. They insure Elbit Systems, Israel's largest weapons producer. We are trying to affect their bottom line. We are trying to make it unprofitable to work with Elbit, and we are determined to do so. We are not going to stop hitting Allianz until they drop Elbit. And they have to start wondering how much this contract is really worth to them. Because for Barclays, they made the decision to divest after Palestine Action began a relentless campaign against them. And we are promising the same for Allianz.
Now, the cost of these actions to some of your members has been pretty high. I understand that there are 18 Palestine Action activists in jail at the moment on terrorism charges. So can I just clarify before we go on, has anybody been hurt by any of these actions?
Palestine Action does not hurt anybody. We attack Elbit weapons sites. And the the reason there are 18 people who are being held under terrorism charges is because of how effective our movement is. Those 18 people are accused of smashing up the crown jewel of Elbit's production site here in the UK, costing Elbit over £1 million worth of damage. Now, previous times we have had high-level actions. Jurors of their peers have occasionally exonerated Palestine Action members, and the state not wanting to allow a people-led embargo, a juror nullification, the opportunity for jurors to nullify these charges against people who were simply trying to stop the genocide with their own hand. They try to stop us with terrorism charges. This hasn't worked either. Actions have continued despite state repression. And I think we really need to understand and take a good hard look at this terrorism act and how it's being used to quell political dissent in this country.
Right. So the victim of the alleged terrorist here is the bottom line of international capital that's profiting from a genocide in Gaza, is what you're saying. How are those prisoners doing? How long have they been in jail, and when are their cases going to be heard?
Listen, I visited one of the 18 members this morning at Wandsworth Prison in southern London, and the conditions that they're subjected to are truly appalling. Filton 18 members are missing meals. They have no hot water. Some of them have been treated as though they were had been convicted when they're being held without trial on remand. And there's a big hearing coming up this month. And if they don't get bail after this hearing, some of them will be looking at being held for over 2 years without trial, without conviction, simply for trying to stop a genocide with their own hands. This is a reality for the UK right now. We are living in a situation in which the moral consciousness of our nation, these people who are the best of us, are being held and could potentially be held for years without trial, simply for attacking the weapons industry of a country that's not even our own.
So the thought here is that the Terrorism Act is being used as a way of stifling dissent in the UK, and is it working? Is Palestine Action sort of becoming less committed to the cause, or is it having the opposite effect?
I mean, one thing that's been incredible is the prisoners' movement that has exploded around the Filton 18. We're having incredible demonstrations outside prisons. We're having cultural workers perform their art. We're having hundreds of people turn up in the parking lots to scream the names of our prisoners so that they can be heard through the walls. There is a real movement happening, and our actions have continued. And the state does seem aware of our ability to rally a crowd, because even though we've had several high-level actions smashing up several weapons factories, most recently an Israeli-owned weapons factory in Newcastle, the state has not charged us as terrorists since. I mean, this situation is so dramatic and so bad for some of the members of the Filton 18 that a member of the public scaled Big Ben and stayed up there for 16 hours this past weekend screaming about the Filton 18 and the abuse of terrorism laws in this country, hoping that people will wake up. There's been, sadly, with the exception of this lovely opportunity, there's been a real dearth of media coverage, even though there's been more and more uses of the Terrorism Act to silence Palestinian political speech.
We only have to look across the Atlantic to see the direction that this kind of repressive legal framework against dissent could move in. So Donald Trump has already threatened to remove federal funding from universities that allow what he calls illegal protests. And Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has, I think today or yesterday, said that he is going to withdraw the green cards of non-US citizens who take part in pro-Palestinian activities. And in fact, one activist was picked up by immigration over the weekend. What do you make of this move in the US, and how is it going to affect your activists there?
Listen, I think we're having a real crisis of democracy. What you're talking about, the kidnapping of Palestinian activists by Homeland Security because they don't like the political speech of legal residents, is truly appalling. But is it any more appalling than calling pro-Palestinian activists who tried to stop the genocide with their own hands terrorists? Is it any more appalling than preventing a Jewish-led picket of the Israeli ambassador? Has been completely banned. Picketing has been banned in this country. People are being held as terrorists for holding up signs. If we don't stop this in its tracks, it's not just going to be Palestine Action members who are being held as terrorists. If they come for us in the morning, they're going to come for you guys at night. This is not going to stop unless we stop it. We need many more people out in the street demanding the freedom of our political prisoners. We need to let Keir Starmer know that using the Justice Department to silence political speech in a time of genocide isn't going to happen. And this is like a weather balloon. The arrest of electronic intifada journalists is a weather balloon. The banning of Palestinian prisoner networks like Samidoun is a weather balloon. And what it leads to is things like Jeremy Corbyn getting arrested at national marches. If we don't stop this repression when it hits the direct actionists, it's going to come for everybody. And that's like the reason they're targeting us is because we're effective. We have shut down permanently 2 Elbit sites in this country, and we have caused millions of pounds worth of damage to the other half dozen remaining, and we're going to continue. We have caused tens of thousands of pounds of damage for those who contract with Elbit or those who invest in Elbit. We are making that company toxic, and because we are so effective, we are facing the pointy end of state repression.
That was Max Geller of Palestine Action speaking to me earlier today. Now, before we go to our next story, a quick reminder that tickets are available for our next Downstream IRL. It will feature Aaron Bastani in conversation with historian Ilan Pappe at Earth Hackney on the 7th of April, and you can buy tickets via the link in the description box below. The Labour Party's enduring legacy is the building of the welfare state. But could Keir Starmer's Labour government be constructing a new legacy, replacing the welfare state with the warfare state? We've already seen international aid slashed to pay part of the cost of meeting Starmer's 2.5% defence budget hike. And over the weekend, Cabinet Minister Pat Methven was asked whether Britain could expect further cuts closer to home.
One other area you could find cuts is welfare reform. Will some of the money the Chancellor needs come out of disability benefits?
We do have a package of welfare changes coming. It'll come pretty soon. And this area of disability benefits is really important. Let me just set out for you and your viewers what is happening here. We have over 9 million people of working age in the country who are not working. Now, some of those are early retirees and so on. But about 30% of those are people on long-term sickness benefits, about 2.8 million people. The cost of this has gone up by about £20 billion in the past few years. Furthermore, the do-nothing trajectory, if you like, is for it to rise to over 4 million people by the end of the decade. That's not fair on the people involved, and it's not fair on the taxpayer. So yes, we do have to act on this to make sure that we give everyone in the country the opportunity to work. We are the Labour Party.
Now, there's no denying that Britain's bill for health-related and disability benefits is growing. Nearly £60 billion was spent on those benefits last year, and that's a sum that's set to rise to over £70 billion by 2030. But some Labour MPs are worried, rightly, that the planned cuts will be more about punishing the poorest than actually tackling the causes of that welfare bill. Speaking to The Guardian, Labour MP Rachel Maskell said this: "We know people who depend on social security, with people struggling in our constituencies. It should be a Labour government alleviating poverty, not adding to it. The Labour government needing to hold its values about addressing poverty. Measures like raising the living wage are really helpful, but it is Gordon Brown economics we need at this time, which are complicated, technical, and targeted. That's not what we're seeing with these broad brush approaches." According to The Telegraph, Maskell has every right to be worried. The paper reports this on Work and Pension Secretary Liz Kendall's plans. Miss Kendall is poised to slash personal independence payments, or PIP, which are handed out to claimants who have trouble with mobility in their everyday lives. She wants to save £5 billion by tightening eligibility, which is expected to target those with milder conditions like anxiety and depression. She's also set to freeze the rate of PIP so that they don't go up in line with inflation from April, unlike other benefits, which will rise by 1.7%. Now, the phrase "handed out to" in that piece, in that little passage, is doing a lot of work there. Like, you don't just turn up to a job centre and get PIP on demand. It's not just handed out to you. To qualify, you have to go through a pretty grueling and often humiliating assessment, and you have to do it again and again as you come up for reassessment. You also don't have to be out of work to get it. Many people on PIP are working, with the benefits assisting them with things like mobility or support costs, the kind of things that actually help people into employment. It's not just PIP recipients likely to feel Kendall's cuts. She also wants to raise a further £1 billion through other measures. ITV reports that the basic rate for universal credit paid to those either searching for or in work will rise, but the rate for those who are judged unfit for work will be cut. That just sounds crazy. Now, it's a pretty punitive approach with little in the way of support for actually getting people into work. Around 80 Labour MPs who just aren't buying the argument are reportedly planning to rebel against the radical cuts. But over on the BBC, trustee Laura Kuenssberg seemed to be doing her best to get her viewers behind the cuts.
Is it fair that you can get as much as an extra £400 a month in benefits if you're sick, rather than somebody who's out of work looking for a job? Is that fair?
What's not fair is for millions of people to be left on long-term sickness benefits with no prospect of work, which is not good for them, and it's not good for the taxpayer.
Is it fair for the taxpayer that some people can get more money if they're on the sick rather than looking for a job?
Well, look, the benefit system recognises that for some conditions people will need extra income, but we are going to bring forward welfare reform plans.
Are you
see how it's done? Is it fair that people on the sick get more money than people who are looking for work? Is it fair on the people looking for work? Is it fair on the taxpayer? The clear implication of the way that Laura Kuenssberg is structuring her question there is that those people on sickness benefits could and should be looking for work, but that may not be the case. That has yet to be shown. Helena, what do you make of these cuts? Like, the government is saying things like, it'll get more people into work, it'll stimulate the economy. Do these kind of stick type approaches, punitive approaches, do they ever actually achieve that?
We were told many times in the run-up to the election that Labour were running on a mandate for change after 14 years of Conservative austerity and cuts and demonisation of people who are disabled and stripping away at the welfare state for 14 years. They said there would be a party of change. Anna Sarwar said, "Read my lips, no austerity under Labour." Keir Starmer stood in the garden at Downing Street and said that the broadest shoulders would have to deal with the financial problems that the country was in, so that he said at the time. Have any of these things actually come to pass? Well, they have changed. They've become somehow worse than the Conservatives. That after 14 years of cuts to the welfare state, they want to go even further and even more targeted at people who are too sick or too disabled to work, or even those disabled people who are currently needing support to make sure they stay in work, which is crazy to think about. It's so much for the party of change, I guess. And you ask the fair question, will this actually help people get into work? First of all, I can't see any evidence that this would, especially when one of the cuts, one of the freezing of the bans, again in real terms as a cut, is for PIP, which hasn't got any work requirements. There are people who are currently in work, people who do have actual disabilities who are in work, who receive PIP, again, having gone through an incredibly humiliating assessment to be able to get it, who require that payment to maintain its real terms level to ensure that they have everything they need to stay in work. By getting rid of that, it makes them more likely to drop out of the workforce, not stay in the workforce. People who are long-term sick, people who have disabilities who are so bad that they cannot work at all, they are the ones who really need the largest level of support, as they are entirely reliant upon the state. That's the whole point. And this idea, Liz Kendall all those weeks ago saying, there are a bunch of people like this who are taking the mickey. Does she have any evidence for this? Is she going to provide any empirical basis for claiming that there are a bunch of people taking the mickey? That the fraud rate at PIP has been adjudged to be literally 0%. There is basically no fraud in PIP whatsoever. And of course, the people who have been signed off as unfit for work, these people have all been judged so by medical professionals. I'm sure Liz Truss has plenty of empirical data that supports her claim, given that she's never actually worked in anything that's relevant to this before in her entire life. She's never been a medical professional. I wonder what she has in her back pocket to be able to be an expert on judging whether or not people are actually fit for work, given that they have been judged so by medical professionals before. It's crazy. I'd like to think that they will try and frame this as, we're the party of work, as if, they're the party of the Protestant work ethic, and not indeed the party of workers, i.e. supposed to support labour versus capital. But we all already know that this party is very much in bed with capital. They don't represent workers, whether they are ones who need help to stay in work or who are so ill they cannot work. They clearly aren't representing these people, because of course these people don't have lobbies that can go to Labour conference and have lovely dinners with the business secretary, for example. They can't pay for people's Glastonbury tickets. They can't pay for Keir Starmer's wife's dresses. Unlike, for example, the CEO of Blackstone, I had a lovely little meeting with Rachel Reeves, as has been reported by Open Democracy, trying to lobby her to change the non-dom tax status changes so that they weren't as removing of those benefits, and they got their wishes. There is no disabled person's lobby that can do the same thing as being an incredibly rich CEO of Blackstone, and that is shown by the callous disregard this current government has to the needs of the disabled and who they actually are shown to favour. And one last point, a lot of this hinges on this idea that somehow that there is this massive opening of jobs for these people to just waltz into. First of all, this is kind of shown by the fact that there aren't actually very many job openings. As we're seeing, there are gaps in the labour market, to be sure, but there are definitely not more job openings than there are people who are currently on long-term sick more broadly. And on top of this, which employer is going to want to employ someone who has previously been found by a medical professional to be too sick that they cannot work? Which employer is going to take these people on if they're getting less support from the state to get themselves into be able to fit state where they can work? None of this makes any sense. It's all being done, as far as I'm concerned, for performative cruelty to try and win over what they see as like a red meat vote, for what they see as the political inclinations of red wall voters, for example. I don't think there's necessarily that much of a political appetite for any cuts specifically to the disabled at all, and more people are really looking for solutions for their own personal lives. And this is a consequence of being entirely subsumed by a Westminster bubble, entirely subsumed by the bubble of a career politician, rather than anybody who spends any time in the real world talking to real people.
I think the point you made there about the meaning of labour is, a fantastic point. And it's almost the thing that sickens me. It's not the thing that sickens me the most, but it sickens me a lot, is this idea that Labour is now positioning itself as the party not of workers or the working class, but rather as those who work, kind of people with a kind of moral rectitude, against those who don't for whatever reason, or who don't work as much for whatever reason. And and as opposed to, as you say, pitching themselves as the party of those who work against capital, or against those who don't work because they're incredibly asset rich or incredibly share rich. And I think one of the things that's going to be most sickening, if, as I suspect, and as if many others suspect, these cuts are coming now because it is, as it were, a move towards finding the funding for the increase in defence, is that what we'll see is what we've seen across Europe as Europe has scrambled to rearm, which is arms manufacturers, arms companies, adding billions to their value as European countries access money. Now, they're doing it in various different kinds of ways, but the way that Labour is doing it, if it is what they're doing, is they're taking it directly from the worst off in our country in order to put it into the hands of companies whose sole purpose is to create other disabled people, create other unwell people around the world. What do you think of that?
I mean, it's very true. And the point you were saying there about, representing people who don't work at all, but who aren't included in this, the phrase economically inactive is talked about a lot, very, very frequently in our media within our political class, right? Are landlords economically active? Are people who live off of trust funds economically active? Are the monarchy economically active? Yet when do they ever face the ire of our politicians? When are they subjected to being talked about, well, why aren't you engaging in the Protestant work ethic? No, it's only the disabled and the sick, the people, again, the defenseless, the powerless, that ever are at the back end of that ire, right? And again, you are right in saying that, there is plenty of space to be able to, if you wanted to engage in military funding, right? Maybe there are some things I've said previously on the show that I think are maybe enhanced investment into cybersecurity, something that's really important and going to be important moving forward. Any investment that you could make, for example, in actual defensive capability that is in trying to bolster now the network of imperial military bases around the world that the UK has, maybe there is some argument that that's worth doing. And the European countries have certainly made those arguments themselves as to why we should be funding these potentially. But there is plenty of wealth that you could be using to fund this. Like if we're going to be defending what our country has become, which is essentially just three financiers in a trench coat, that's what the UK economy is in 2025. It's the people have all the money and all of the assets are the super rich, the super wealthy, the millionaires and the billionaires. Those are the ones whose property and whose country they essentially own now since it got sold off in the 80s that we are going to be defending through whatever new defence budget we might raise to do that. If we're going to be defending their assets and the capital that they control, that they were sold off by Thatcher and Blair throughout the entirety of the 80s, 90s and the 2000s and the austerity period as well, maybe they should cough up and pay for it. Maybe they should start paying a wealth tax, for example, as the Green Party have been recommending, such as 1% on £10 million wealth or higher and 2% taxation on £1 billion wealth or higher. And if we really, really have to spend this money on a potential increase in defence budgets, why aren't we asking the super rich to pay for it? The broadest shoulders, as Starmer said.
Absolutely right, Helena. I want to go on now to other sources of funding for that increased defence spending. So, as we all know, Labour has already abandoned our poorest children, as well as pensioners struggling to pay their bills, with the government showing that for them, pragmatism trumps principle almost every time. But those decisions to keep the 2-child benefit cap and to scrap the winter fuel allowance came long before Keir Starmer's recent focus on defence. In the last 2 weeks, £12 billion in cuts have now been proposed to first international aid and now welfare. That's pretty much bang on the sum the government will need to raise each year to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. That's its aim by 2027. But while Labour principles may come and go, one thing that's proved ironclad is Labour's commitment to Chancellor Rachel Reeves' self-imposed fiscal rules. Her aim is to bring down the national debt in this parliament, and she's set tough limits to borrowing to achieve it. But those rules now mean that the government is denying itself access to other sources of money precisely at the time it needs it most, creating the illusion that budgetary cuts are an absolute necessity. Other countries even more fiscally conservative than ours, have somehow managed to find another way to fund new defence plans. Germany's incoming Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, is trying to throw out his own country's rulebook on borrowing by rewriting Germany's debt brake. Now, Merz is in no way some socialist utopian. He's from the centre-right Christian Democrats, the party of fiscal conservatism and austerity. It was his party under Angela Merkel that wrote the anti-borrowing rule into the country's constitution. And if his plan goes ahead and he has the backing of the centre-left Social Democrats, it'll give Germany access to $1.3 trillion worth of spending. Most of that money will be for rearmament, but around a third will go to big infrastructure projects involving transport, energy, and housing. And you know what? Economists love it. A survey of economists by the Financial Times has found them supportive of the plans, with some saying Germany could go even further and spend €2 trillion without harming growth. Helena, while both Germany's and the UK's economies are stagnating, we shouldn't erase important differences between them. Germany's national debt is around 60% of GDP, while the UK's is 95%, more or less. But let's talk about the principle. Many economists are lauding Merz's plans as an economy-stimulating move, a boom move. Has the prospect of war suddenly brought economic Keynesianism back into fashion?
I think that's fundamentally true. The perceived risks that an unstable world poses to certain nation states gives them the impetus to go out and throw out the levels of fiscal responsibility in the name of security, right? Now, of course, as a leftist, as a Keynesian, a post-Keynesian myself as well, I would argue that there was never any need for fiscal responsibility. You actually have to understand what you're using your budget for. It's about what you're spending on, how your country is growing. We all knew in the UK that the austerity period was bad for economic growth. It was bad for the nation state more broadly, and it was bad for the security of the nation regardless, right? They say, well, we need to defend our countries in Europe, for example, which is why we need to spend this money on the military. I'm looking at the UK and saying, well, what are we defending, right? Well, all these videos of people like Politics Joe did, or it might have been Joe themselves, did a bunch of Vox Pop videos with people, young men, saying, would you go out and fight for their country? Basically, all of them said that they wouldn't go and fight for their country. Well, because there's nothing worth defending anymore. It's interesting that the security of, again, the poorest, or broadly the population at large through social programs and social welfare isn't seen as a priority, especially when you're constrained within European Union economics by things like the excessive deficit protocol, which means you can't run up deficits higher than 3%. They obviously relaxed these during the pandemic period, but countries like France are potentially going to be on the sharp end of the EU coming down on them for spending above that pretty frequently, And if you want to look at the kind of the less economically prosperous Europe over the 2010 to 2015, 2025 period, and you compare that to the United States post financial crisis, where they looked at the austerity and the fiscal constraints that Europe was imposing upon itself in the post-2010 era and thought, well, I'm going to take that, I'm going to put it in the bin. I'm just going to run a bunch of deficits and engage in spending. This was turbocharged by the Biden administration. They were running 7% deficits, and they weren't doing this necessarily on military spending. Plenty of American money was already being spent on the military-industrial complex, and they always have done. But at the very least, from 2020 until 2024, these deficits were used to fund things like grand infrastructure projects, which is why America is growing really, really fast, and European countries, especially Germany, are looking like they were going to be in recession. Like Yanis Varoufakis has talked a lot about the rentier economy and the ways in which for a very long time, central banks have had to engage in quantitative easing to maintain aggregate demand. So essentially, to stop retentions from happening at all, they've had to engage in pretty kind of stimulus, they're engaging lots of fiscal stimulus to be able to do that. Now, governments, mostly conservative ones across the European continent, including in the UK, especially under the conservative governments of the recent past, have used that as a way of being able to funnel money into financial assets without using it to engage in actual government spending. This was why during the liquidity trap of the 2010s, the Corbyn plan in 2017 especially was to use the people's quantitative easing, which is to take new money from the Bank of England, fund it directly into large infrastructure projects to rebuild the shattered public realm, which is essentially the same thing as what the Biden administration has been doing. That's all new money from the Treasury rather than being used as the traditional like issuing of bonds, etc., etc. So there was plenty of scope to try and stimulate economic growth during this period to rebuild the public realm. And it never happened. It never happened. It shows you, especially amongst liberal and conservative governments across Europe, what they perceive to be the important threats to the stability of their country. And it's not the lives of their own citizens a lot of the time. And now we're outside of the European Union. We have so much scope. We are no longer constrained by the excessive deficit protocol. We're no longer constrained by the Lisbon Treaty to do the people's quantitative easing. Now, inflation is going down. We have anemic growth. We could be doing this to engage in all the spending we need to create the green economy. And we could also do that for extra military investment if we wanted to. That's not going to increase the supply of goods and services, though, which is where we actually need to be doing what Janet Yellen calls modern supply-side economics, which would grow the economy and be more prosperous for everyday citizens. But that's not going to happen with military Keynesianism. It might grow the economy, but for whom? Just arms manufacturers? I hardly think that's going to be the pinnacle of where we could be doing a bunch of these expansionary projects if we were going to do them. And we're also not doing any of them because Rachel Reeves is crazily bound by her own fiscal rules, which prevent her from doing that. So the fact that Rachel Reeves is less visionary, more fiscally austere, and quite frankly, even less constrained than what Friedrich Merz would be, he is being far more radical in terms of where he's looking at for economic stimulus than Rachel Reeves is, our supposed Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's madness.
The reform meltdown continues apace, with one of the party's 5 MPs losing the whip over the weekend. Rupert Lowe, MP for Great Yarmouth and former chairman of Southampton Football Club, was suspended last week after Reform reported him to the police for alleged threats of violence towards the party's chairman, Zia Yusuf. A joint statement by Yusuf and Reform's chief whip, Lee Anderson, also alleged that 2 female employees had complained about serious bullying in Lowe's office. Here's part of that statement. Evidence was provided to us of workplace bullying, the targeting of female staff who raised concerns, and evidence of derogatory and discriminatory remarks made about women, including reference to a perceived disability. We feel we have a duty of care to all our staff, whether employed directly or indirectly. Accordingly, we appointed an independent King's Counsel to conduct an investigation into the veracity of these complaints. To date, Mr. Lowe has yet to cooperate with this investigation. In addition to these allegations of a disturbing pattern of behaviour, Mr. Lowe has, on at least 2 occasions, made threats of physical violence against our party chairman. Accordingly, this matter is with the police. The party is now in open civil war over the suspension. On GB News, it was put to Reform's deputy leader, Richard Tice, that the timing seemed a little suspicious.
The timing doesn't just look coincidental, it looks a little bit malicious.
Well, I've just told you.
The allegations refer to something that happened in December. And you decided to come out with it. No, let me finish my question if you don't mind, because it is my show. You come out with the statement on Thursday after Rupert Lowe has questioned whether Nigel Farage is fit to be Prime Minister. There was no need to have released the statement immediately after that interview. These allegations refer to something back in December. So, of course, the timing looks deeply suspicious. And it suggests you've mishandled it.
Far from it. We've done the appropriate and responsible thing to do. There was a further threat made to Zia literally last week. So at the end of the day...
What's the nature of these threats?
I'm not going to go into any details of that, but ultimately, as chairman, Zia's got significant responsibilities. Imagine if we'd done the opposite. Imagine if we'd brushed this all under the carpet.
Well, you could have conducted an internal investigation and then revealed the findings. Even the KC in this seems to think that you put this statement out too early.
The reality is that we have been working incredibly hard. We're going up in the polls. But the truth is, hang on, hear me out. The truth is that these difficulties have been ongoing for some time. We hoped that they could be dealt with.
Now, Rupert Lowe himself, well, he denies everything. He's accused Farage of a, quote, a vindictive witch hunt after Lowe told the Daily Mail that the leader acted like a messiah and needed to delegate. And he claims the allegations against him are maliciously concocted and, quote, a coordinated hit job to force me out of Reform. In an interview with Dan Wootton, he discussed allegations made against him by party figures.
The most damning claim made against you by senior Reform figures over the past 72 hours, and this is, of course, their words, not mine, but it's that you are an out-of-control, a violent man who has made threats to party officials and is even suffering from early onset dementia. And I know you want to respond directly. So is any of that true?
Well, Dan, let me tell you, this event on Friday came out of the sun like a spitfire. There was no discussion before it, so it's mystifying from top to bottom, frankly. In answer to your question, how am I? I'm fine. Compared with football, this is child's play. Try sitting in a football stadium with 32,500 people chanting "Rupert Lowe is a WANKER," telling your wife it's not true. And the other favourite chant was "Swing Rupert Lowe from the Itchen Bridge." So, look,
so you're used to this.
I've been through this. This is child's play, and the disappointing thing is it's very malicious child's play. I mean, people can judge whether they think I've got early onset dementia. I mean, that really is, that's playing the man, not the ball in football terms. So, I mean, it's complete rubbish.
Ben Habib, the former co-deputy leader of Reform, who was ousted by Farage, told The Observer he thought the allegations against Lowe were part of a, quote, playbook used against those who are no longer in favour. Helena, it's all kicking off in the Golden Twilight retirement home for men. What's your diagnosis here?
I mean, the thing is the big picture, it's good that if there are any allegations, they are being investigated. And Richard Tice and Nigel Farage, especially Richard Tice, really, has been doing a lot of the media rounders on Laura Kuenssberg. He's been on Sky News and places like that, making the legitimate point that, well, we receive these allegations, right? We don't know whether they are true or not, but what we need to do is make sure the entire process is followed. His whip will be suspended until these investigations have been carried out and we find out the veracity of these things, because we want to look like a professional party, for example, And these are very reasonable things to say. Like, that's the kind of big picture here, because a lot of the things that are being alleged that Rupert Lowe has done, these aren't very good, right? A lot of these things are really bad. It's really bad look for your party too. If you have one MP who was said in court statements to have kicked his ex-girlfriend, and then another one comes up and there are these allegations of bullying female co-workers, right? Again, these are just allegations. We do not know whether they're true. The whole point of investigations is you find out whether they are true or not, and then you act accordingly. But whilst you do those, you suspend your MP and have the whip suspended whilst those are carried out. This is normal procedure, right? But granularly, it is really important, and Camilla Tominey was also right to point out, it looks a little bit coincidental that suddenly these allegations surface immediately after Rupert Lowe has this kind of critical approach to Nigel Farage's leadership of the party. I mean, it's only recently started acting like an actual party. Before, up until the 20th of February, I think it was a limited company with Nigel Farage as the majority shareholder. So it did look a lot like a Nigel Farage vanity project for a very, very long time. But part of this professionalization of the party has involved the bringing in Zia Youssef as chairman, having a proper party structure, turning it into a not-for-profit with no share ownership, and then having members been given the ability to be able to have a vote of no confidence in their leader. It's looking a little bit more like a party moving forward. But like any party, there is the internal stuff that happens behind the scenes. Now here, we on the left, we like to call ourselves out for infighting all the time, but the right wing is just as bad, if not worse, for infighting, right? And it's also interesting that people always try to decry Jeremy Corbyn as leading a Stalinist Labour Party when he was anything but, and he trying to bring people all together all the time. When the major parties in this country, they're incredibly Stalinist. It's all compromat. There's been rumours of there being, the whole dossier of compromise that the Conservative Party has internally on each other. The current Labour leadership brief against each other day after day after day, and the people they don't like within the party, right? The circular firing squad is part and parcel of British politics, and it really has always been, especially amongst right-wing parties, which is full of big characters, people who have personal ideologies and things they want to put into practice, but they also have a certain level of ambition, a certain level of ego. And these things are always going to clash, especially in a party with only 5 MPs, which is a particularly new party as well. So I would not be surprised in the slightest if, and again, if this is true, may or may well not be, it turns out that these allegations were given all the way back in December, and they were only released now as a way of trying to discipline Rupert Lowe from being a little bit too big for his boots, ever since Elon Musk said that he should take over from Nigel Farage as being the leader of Reform UK. And as a left-wing person, I would much rather have Nigel Farage as the leader of Reform UK, quite frankly, because Nigel Farage is positively moderate in comparison to some of the pretty extreme views that I personally believe are extreme that Rupert Lowe has and he extols daily on his Twitter account. You only have to look through the things that he says to understand that I think this man is a pretty radical and dangerous voice in British politics. Seeing him potentially outside of Reform UK's political future is something that I'm very, very happy to see more broadly. And I think tactically it also makes sense for Reform UK as well. Like Rupert Lowe's extremism, in my mind, only really appeals to the headbangers who are already bought into Reform UK. Rupert Lowe not being with the party anymore, whilst Nigel Farage and Richard Tice try and court more moderate voters by moderating the voice of the party in the same way Le Pen has done with the Rassemblement National in France, is where their electoral force is going to come from. If they put off people by looking a little bit too ethno-nationalist, in my opinion, it's not going to be a way of being electorally successful, which is what matters in a system like first past the post. And people who are die-hard Rupert Lowe supporters who are on the more right-wing end of the party, they've got nowhere else to go. Well, they're going to vote for the Reclaim Party or the Homeland Party. It's very unlikely that they're going to do so. Their fundamental approach to politics is going to get them success. Is going to be supporting Reform UK. And Rupert Lowe continually dragging the party rightwards is not going to help their broader appeal.
Yeah, I completely agree, Helena. And actually, many times I've wondered why action wasn't taken against Rupert Lowe before now. The man tweets so many times a day, I don't know, 15, 20 times a day, just flinging out the most kind of extreme policy suggestions, really appealing to, as you say, the headbangers. And I think if there's anything that Nigel Farage understands, and, no matter what you think of Farage, he's an incredibly successful political figure in the UK. He's managed to change this country perhaps more than any other individual political leader in living memory. Well, maybe not as much as Thatcher, let's say that. But he understands that in order to win and in order to form a government, he has to have a broad appeal and he has to connect with a wide range of voters, not just those voters who would like to see, immigrants rounded up and deported. Many British people would be completely against that, while at the same time thinking, okay, well, maybe there should be controls of immigration, and they trust reform to do that more than they trust the Tories to do it now. So yeah, to me, it's no surprise that this has happened, and I'm kind of surprised it didn't happen sooner. Perhaps Rupert Lowe just isn't the sort of person who responds to ideas of party discipline. The Majority Report's Sam Seder recently agreed to participate in something pretty bizarre. Surrounded by 20 American conservatives, he took part in a 90-minute debate against all of them. The event was structured around Seder making 4 claims about the Trump administration, with the young conservatives, and they were all really, really young, taking him on. And they really did not self-censor. This was one responding to Seder's claim that unless you're a billionaire, a religious fundamentalist, or a xenophobic nationalist, voting for Trump was a mistake.
What's the problem with xenophobic nationalism? Don't you think that's better for Americans in general?
Xenophobic nationalism is better?
We should have a coherent culture. Everyone should be a part of the same culture. We should have assimilation.
Do you get to choose what the culture is?
We already have a dominant culture.
What is the dominant culture?
Based on European and Christian values and identity. That is the dominant culture.
White Christian,
it's rooted in European identity.
So your argument is that
has been the dominant culture.
Just to be clear.
And we're not letting people assimilate to that. We're saying you should keep your culture, and this is why our culture is so divided.
Your argument is that Trump is good for those who want a dominant white European culture.
I mean, that is what America is. It's rooted in European identity and Christian values. That's what it has been. Would you really disagree with that? What is it then, if that's not the identity of America?
Well, I think the identity of America...
For the majority of time, America's been a country. You don't think that's been the identity?
Well, actually, no. I think actually the identity of America has been, for better or for worse, a melting pot in that regard.
Yeah, maybe since the 1960s. Even then, even we had this idea of a melting pot literally means assimilation too. It means melting. It means you're assimilating to the dominant culture. Is that not what melting means?
No, it doesn't
and
mean
now instead we're saying there's something wrong with xenophobia. Dominant
culture. No. I mean, look, I got to be honest with you, you and I have a fundamental disagreement. We will never see eye to eye on this. It's a choice. And I think what you're expressing, though, is really what the Trump movement at its heart is about. And I think that's problematic.
I disagree. I don't think Trump's anywhere close to being a Christian nationalist. That's ridiculous. Trump's basically a Democrat from 15 years ago when it comes to social issues.
So you don't think that he's conservative enough for you?
Oh, definitely. Nowhere close. No.
He's not xenophobic enough for you?
No, he's trying to import a bunch of H-1Bs. Are you kidding?
Right. Oh, so you want to get them out too? Yeah. No, I think you're making my argument for me.
Wow. Just fully embracing xenophobic nationalism. It's the political position of 2025, apparently, if you're white and very, very blonde. Another of Seder's claims was that Trump's attack on DEI hides his real goal, which is to give corporations more power. Here's how another of the conservatives responded.
If you were racist, right, and you were an employer, and if you wanted to absolutely be racist and exercise that, you would. I think DEI sort of prevents people from seeing the reality. If a person truly wanted to hire you based on your intellect, based on your skill set, they would. DEI essentially provides tax cuts. For the end of the year, when you create your tax returns, they give you a tax credit for hiring someone who is Black or a person of color. I don't know if you knew that.
In these agencies?
In agencies and private
in government
businesses.
Agencies, they don't get tax cuts for hiring people of color.
And the other thing I wanted
this is to protect people from discrimination.
The other thing I want to kind of state here is that I've realized that a lot of the times with the liberals is that you guys push for example, for DEI and people of Latino or Hispanic descent. And a lot of the times what you don't realize is you're actually doing more harm than good by putting them in positions where you make them believe that it's based on the color of their skin. It's based on...
DEIA does not... is not.
It's based on merit. DEI emphasizes color, skin color, physical attributes.
It says that the people who work in your agency, it's about anti-discrimination.
Discrimination against what?
Against people who may have different cultural mores, may have different...
But that's irrelevant to a job, right? It should be based on merit. And that is the emphasis
People
here.
get hired as a merit, but if the DEIA, I'm talking about Trump's rescission of these orders on these agencies.
If you received a tax cut as an employer, wouldn't you hire a person of color?
Dude,
if you could pay them less?
Listen, we're talking about government agencies that do not get tax cuts. Government agencies.
They don't.
No.
They do. They absolutely do.
I'm talking about
every private and public sector gets tax cuts when you hire a person of color.
Government agencies don't pay taxes. Government agencies are funded by the government.
That is not true. That is not true. And you know what? I think the whole juxtapose of this entire conversation...
What month is this?
This is January.
Okay, so we can agree on that.
No more tax breaks for government departments. Let's tax their profits and their shareholders. These are the people who literally want to take apart the Department of Education in the US. Helena, I don't really want to talk about their arguments, but what I am interested in is how young they are and how kind of trendy they look. What is it with this new conservatism with its sort of, attractive influencer veneer?
What's interesting is that previously, I touched on this a bit last week, and I'll touch on it again here, that in the 2015, 2016 era, the Conservatives prided themselves on the facts over feelings, right? The facts don't care about your feelings was the refrain of Ben Shapiro for a very, very long time, right? And these people can't even get basic facts right. I'll touch on one of the arguments that was made there, which is this idea that there's this European culture that underpins America. And I'm like, what unified European culture? What? Somehow, especially amongst American neo-Nazis, they will try and make it seem like the Europe is a white entity that they just come from because they have no connection to it. They're born in America, they're raised in America. They don't have any connections to Europe at all other than the lineage of their parents. They don't understand because they've never been. Serbia has a different culture from Austria, which has a different culture from Spain, which has a different culture from Norway, from the UK, from Ireland, right? The idea that any of this is kind of monolithic at all is quite frankly insane. It's insane that you'd think that. And the reason you get to a point of not thinking that is because the public education in America is bad. Why do you think the Republicans want to defund public education? It's so that these people don't end up getting an actual holistic understanding of history more broadly, and they can get propagandized to by American media outlets, right? And anti-intellectualism underpins a lot of the mainstream radical right at the moment, right? The radical right that's a large part of American politics, and it's kind of growing in UK politics, but to a lesser extent, right? Anti-empiricism, in fact, a lot of their viewpoints, a lot of conservative viewpoints, disagree so much with the scientific consensus nowadays, disagrees with a lot of kind of historical consensus nowadays as well. And because they can't run on facts don't care about your feelings anymore because of that disconnect between, basic reality and the things that they believe, they have come to distrust basically all institutions, scientific and educational institutions, as rote, because it doesn't reconfirm their priors a lot of the time. And the anti-intellectual tradition is being preyed upon by influencers to try and attract a fan base. And unless you have an empirical basis for the things that you believe, it'll end up turning into a cult mentality where people will refuse to hear reason. They will refuse to hear rebuttings of the things that they say that are total nonsense, like government agencies getting tax cuts when they are literally being funded by taxation. These are things that are impossible to argue against because it's just a basic fact of reality. You're living in totally different realities, right? You'll show Trump supporters the evidence that Doge hasn't cut funding for transgender mice. They have cut funding for experiments that use mice, or transgenic mice, they're to use as a testing body for some kind of hormone replacement therapy or other type thing, And unless you can get them to engage with like basic facts, they're not going to get out of that little bubble that they've been put in. And this can affect young people who are very, very online just as much as the elderly as well. I mean, it's interesting. The millennials are actually more left-wing in both the UK and in the US than Zoomers are in both those countries. But I think it's more pronounced in America than it is over here, where young people are more left-wing than they are there. But especially in America, the digital natives of the millennials, they've kind of been able to scrutinize the information that they've received from the internet because they grew up throughout the establishment of the internet being part of their daily lives. Where a bunch of Zoomers who came into it, who've only ever known the internet, aren't as critical with the sources that they receive and the propaganda that they're told. And so they're very easy to recruit into this anti-intellectual radical sphere that's been created by Trumpism.
Helena, we're going to call it there. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
It's an absolute pleasure. Always good to see you, Stephen.
Very good to see you too, as ever. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Come back on tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.